So let's get a couple of housekeeping things out of the way before we get to you, Stephen. So I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As I'm doing introductions, go ahead and complete the poll that you see on your screen, please, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. If you have questions during the presentation, if you will put those in the Q&A box, please, I would appreciate that. We have a lot going on in the chat. It's hard to feed through that chat. So if you'll put any questions in that Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, we would appreciate that. The poll should be up on your screen right now for you to be taking that. If you're having any technical issues during this time, our technical specialist, Zach, will be available to help you. He is on, so you can be sure and chat with Zach if you're having any technical issues with that. So let me introduce myself. My name is Stephanie McLaughlin, and I am the Training and Evaluation Specialist for the Partners Resource Network. So Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of parent training and information centers. We are funded through the Department of Education, Office of Special Education. Our PTI projects here in Texas are PATH, PIN, and TEAM. We strive to empower and support our Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or health care needs. So we're so thankful to have you here today. Joining me is our Director of Statewide Services, Christina Henning, and our support specialist, Chelsea Rivas. So thank you all for being here. I want to go ahead and get you to our main speaker today as quickly as possible. So I'm going to introduce him, and then we're going to talk about that poll. So you just have another moment to answer those two questions on the poll. So our guest speaker today is Stephen Allman. He is an attorney and policy specialist with Disability Rights Texas. Prior to joining Disability Rights, Stephen had many years of experience in policy analysis, law, mediation, and teaching, all connected to individuals with disabilities. He has worked both in Washington, D.C. at the federal level and in Austin, Texas at the state level. Drawing on this broad range of experience, Stephen serves as the in-house expert at Disability Rights Texas on education issues affecting students with disabilities in Texas. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Let's look at that poll really quick, and then we're going to let Stephen take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to continue to leave the poll open so we can get some answers as people join us a little bit later. But what we're looking at right now on the first question of do you have a copy of your child's current IEP, we have 69% that say yes, 31% that say no. On the second question, have you heard yet from your child's school about his or her special education services? Yes is 69%. And no is 31%. Like I said, I'll keep the poll open while we're going. For those of us that just joined us, or if you're not seeing the poll, if you'll look at your toolbar, there'll be a poll icon and you just click on it. All right, I'm gonna mute myself.
Turn it over to Stephen. I want to remind you to put any questions you have in that Q&A box at the bottom. On that panel, if you'll put the questions in that box, we would appreciate it. So, Stephen, we're going to turn it over to you now.
Great. If we could advance the slide, please. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you during this very challenging time to try to provide some information on the policy and legal front as the state, like the nation, confronts the coronavirus outbreak and school closures, the shutdown of our communities. In today's presentation, we're going to try to do 4 things and leave time for questions at the end. I'm going to just talk very briefly about the status of school closures and what school districts are generally doing about trying to somehow still educate all students. Next, we're going to talk about what the federal government has said so far about special education during this challenging time, as well as what has the state of Texas said about special education services during school closures. Next, we'll move to some key provisions in special education law that are important to remember at this time, things that will help you be tracking about what your school district is doing and as well as then moving on to specific advocacy tips for parents. Again, things that you should be mindful of to help you to ensure that the child does the best possible in these very, very unusual period of our history. And again, at the end, we'll try to leave time for your direct questions. Again, there is a very specific feature in Zoom that you see at the bottom called Q&A. Please put your questions for me about policy and legal connected to special education there. Anything about sort of the operation of the webinar and other general comments you can put into the chat function. Next slide, please. So let's go ahead and talk about where we are right now in Texas with regard to public education. This all started happening sort of in late February in terms of the awareness of the coronavirus and the outbreak and initial planning. The Texas Education Agency, TEA for short, began issuing some initial notices about the potential effects in late February, but it wasn't until March 19th that Governor Abbott issued an executive order that closed all schools in Texas. That included both public and private elementary and secondary education schools, as well as colleges for that matter. Just yesterday, on March 31st, the governor issued a new executive order that superseded the order issued in mid-March. So as of now, all schools in Texas are closed until Monday, May 4, 2020. So the short of it is that we have a long month of April to go on top of what's already happened in March in terms of school closures. Now, I want to make clear that the governor's order that closes all schools in Texas through effectively early May could possibly would still nonetheless allow school districts to make their own decisions about what to do. So while the governor has closed schools through May 4 for the remainder of the school year, once we get to May, assuming there's not another order by Governor Abbott, it will become a local decision of whether or not to reopen or remain closed for the remainder of the 2019-2020 school year. Just to clarify, at the statewide level, the Texas Education Agency, our State Department of Education, does not have the legal authority to close public schools. So it's either going to be issued through the governor or local school districts in conjunction with their civic leaders, mayors, county judges will making those decisions. But that being said, the Texas Education Agency, or TEA, is playing a vital role during this period of school closures. The Commissioner of Education is holding regular meetings with superintendents around the state. That's already been happening through conference calls, and that TEA has put together an abundance of information, advice, and guidance for school districts to continue to serve students during these period of school closures of campuses. Next slide, please. So in general, about all of these school closures, you can find information on a dedicated page on the Texas Education Agency website. I provided the link to that website in the slide, and we'll also copy and paste that into the chat, please, Stephanie. But in terms of school closures, we want to be clear that the message from the governor and the message from the Texas Education Agency is that just because your campus is closed now, that doesn't mean that schooling has ended for this school year. Instructional services are still going to be provided in some form or fashion through under an umbrella term that we are using in this state called Instructional Continuity. That's sort of the new, in education lingo, the new term that we're relying upon now. Instructional continuity refers to schools still providing some level of instruction and services to all students, including students in special education and to students under Section 504 plans. Now, it's key to know here that there is a lot of guidance and direction from TEA about instructional continuity, but what it actually looks like at the local level is up to your school district, your school superintendent, and your school board, and your school administrators. What it looks like, and for that matter, when they're actually launching their instructional continuity plans. So as much as we would love to tell you that districts should be doing this and that by a certain date, that's not possible. Instructional continuity is going to look different everywhere across the state, although again, there are these guidelines as to planning and launching it. Next slide, please. Now, in the interest of time, of course, and to get to question and answers, I'm providing a very high-level overview of all of these developments and legal guidance and practical tips for parents. There's going to be a lot of information I'm just not able to cover today, which is why we have provided you all of these links. And again, Stephanie, if you could copy these links into the chat function. I want to start out specifically about special education. In addition to all the guidance about instructional continuity in general, TEA also has a dedicated page for special education. And I want to tell you that on that page, a lot of it is guided or directed to school districts about maintaining legal requirements in special education. There's not per se a parent guide or parent information sheet. We'll come to some later slides today with some resources specifically developed for parents. But I do want you to know that if you want to go see what TEA is saying to school districts about special education, then this is where you would go. Now, specifically, I want to point out at the bottom of slide 5 is what we have now is the current very specific guidance for special education. I also want to be very clear now that this is all evolving. What your districts is doing is evolving, and what the Texas Education Agency is producing as guidance, not just about instructional continuity, but about special education, is evolving. The reference to Thursday, March 26th, is the last version of a guidance document for school districts on special education. There were already at least 2 versions before that. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is the heading of the document. There is an image on your screen now on slide 6. It says COVID-19 and Special Education in Texas. This is the title of this guidance document from TEA for school districts. And as you see on the slide, in the image, it is dated. So every version is dated. This one is dated March 26, 2020. I want to emphasize, if you go look at the TEA website, which I encourage you to do, just be aware that you're always going back and checking for the most current version of documents. Now, with regard to state policy in special education, my understanding is that we are expecting more guidance as early as the end of this week. So do check back to the general TEA page devoted to COVID-19 and the coronavirus outbreak, as well as the special education page. Those are the 2 best places to go to see what will come out later this week, and I'm sure in the coming weeks as well. But these links that we have just put into the chat are current as of today. Next slide, please. Now, shifting gears from what Texas is doing, I do want to also update you that the federal government has also acted and started to notify school districts across the country about what they should be doing during this time of school closures, because obviously what is happening here in Texas is not unique. Many states have closed their school systems statewide, although there are some states where it's still school district by school district determination. But in terms of the U.S. Department of Education, they have a general coronavirus COVID-19 page where you can find all relevant documentation. Specifically on that page, you'll see that I am providing the links to 3 documents. And Stephanie, again, if we could copy and paste these all into the chat. What you'll see here are the most recent issued guidance documents with regard to special education and Section 504. As you probably know, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is the principal law that governs services to students with disabilities who have an individualized education program or IEP. We don't want to forget that there are other students with disabilities in our public schools who sometimes have what we refer to as a Section 504 plan. Section 504, just to remind you all, is a separate federal law that generally is directed at stopping discrimination against persons with disabilities, including students in our public schools with disabilities. And so the federal guidance is important to be aware of, because the Texas Education Agency typically does not issue Section 504 guidance. 504 enforcement is really more at the federal level. And so to the extent that there are any 504 issues, accessibility issues, equal opportunity issues, then you'll turn to this guidance document. But again, I want to emphasize these are current as of today. Always check back to the Department of Education website as well for the most current version of documents if you have some need to review this at a later date. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's shift gears now. And again, in the interest of time, I know I'm sort of going a little fast. Hopefully I'm not speaking too fast for you, but I want to make sure that we get some good basic information out to everyone who's on the call, the Zoom. And so we've covered now sort of the general state of school closures through May 4th, what the Texas Education Agency has issued by way of guidance to schools, what the federal government has issued to guidance to schools. Let's talk now about some existing provisions in law that we've always relied upon that I believe will become more important, or already more important, during this period of school closures. I want to start out, of course, by emphasizing that communication, goodwill, and cooperation are key on both sides, by way of school districts and by way of parents, to make sure that we give our students and children the best possible opportunity to have a positive experience during all of this uncertainty. I know everyone is stressed for any number of reasons, from employment to being cooped up in home, but we all need to take a deep breath and appreciate that we're still together, and we still have a chance to make it through all of this in a positive way. I also want to emphasize again, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to review every possible scenario or provision of law that's applicable to unique circumstances, but I think a lot of what we're about to talk about will be of help to many people. Next slide, please. Let me start with talking about prior written notice. Prior written notice, or sometimes we use the acronym PWN, is an essential procedural safeguard or legal right that parents have, both under Section 504 and under IDEA. And it's something that schools have to give to you anytime that something's going to possibly change, either because the school wants to change something or you want to change something. So I want to be clear that prior written notice is a requirement, but there are very specific requirements about what is a legally compliant prior written notice. And I know that already some school districts are issuing notices to parents, some of which I've had the chance to see, which really aren't technically a legally compliant prior written notice. So just be mindful that you will be receiving probably a lot of information from schools. Some of it will be labeled as a prior written notice. Just review those documents very carefully. Keep copies of them. They're going to become important later on, undoubtedly, especially if, and unfortunately, if disputes arise. So just be aware that in Texas, with regard to the special education prior written notice, schools need to give that to you at least 5 school days in advance. And right now, if schools I know we're talking about school closures, but if schools are essentially serving the general population, then that counts as a school day. So unless you waive the timeline, schools are needing to act essentially as if it's a regular school week and give that prior written notice in special education at least 5 days in advance. Next slide, please. Let's talk about admission review and dismissal committee meetings, or what we fondly call here in Texas the ARD committee or ARD committee. We all know that that's essentially the IEP team under special education law that makes decisions about who's eligible and what types of special education services they're going to get. I want to emphasize with regard to ARD meetings that we're all used to going to school and having that meeting in a conference room, maybe in the special ed director's conference room off to the side, but there is nothing in the law that says it has to be an in-person meeting. That's just our custom and our practice because, you know, being around each other is helpful for any number of reasons. But it is perfectly legal for the school to say to you, we're going to do this by conference call. We're going to do this by using the technology today by Zoom. So don't worry about not having an ARD meeting because we can't get together now because of the stay-at-home orders and the shutdown of the campuses. ARD committees can still happen right now. I want to emphasize that. Now, I want to also emphasize a provisional law, which some of us have encountered before, where sometimes the school will ask you to excuse certain ARD committee members because their role isn't really necessary in that particular discussion. We want you to we want to encourage parents to exercise their judgment about excusing committee members. You will probably be asked to do that. Generally speaking, that probably isn't a bad idea, just so you can get to have the meeting. But just be mindful that if you do feel that someone at the school is going to be important in the conversation about how things are going at home now with the delivery of special ed services, you have the right to say, I understand you don't want that person to be here, but I do want them to be here. But just be prepared then to, I think as a courtesy to the school, say why you want that person. And so we just offer that advice about who's going to be participating in these virtual ARD committee meetings during this period. And of course, otherwise, you have the full rights that we would have with a regular, quote unquote, regular ARD committee meeting when you went to the school, the right to disagree at the end, sign an agreement, whatever else would normally happen with regard to ARD committee meetings. No, nothing about those rules have been suspended. Let me just make one other mention here about ARD committee meetings as they are scheduled virtually. Of course, one benefit of them being in person is that the school district can hand you a draft document or document to work with as you go through the meeting. Be in touch with your school district about how you're going to handle the paperwork part of this. Are you going to get an email attachment? Are you going to share a screen like we are doing now and look at it on the computer together? If the school district doesn't say something to you about not just meeting virtually, but how you're going to do the paperwork virtually, then don't worry. Email or call to say, you know, I want to see a draft of this before we get started, or can I see it as we're working through it. Next slide, please. This goes hand in hand with the actual work of the ARD committee, and that is to develop an individualized education program, or IEP. Obviously, we have to look at that IEP for any number of reasons, including sort of the regular review of it on an annual basis to start planning for the next school year. Many of you may have already been anticipating having an annual ARD committee to review the IEP for next school year in this coming month of April, for instance. So what happens now with regard to IEPs? Generally speaking, the advice from the Texas Education Agency, and we don't disagree with this, is to start thinking about IEPs in two parts. One is sort of like, what are we doing right now because of this emergency situation, And if anything has to change, such as the schedule of services, let's make an amendment to that. But otherwise, when things get, quote, back to normal, or if we're planning an art committee that will also overlap into the 2020-2021 school year, then you should start devising that just as you normally would. And so you might see IEP documents that structurally get broken into two pieces, sort of a here and now, and later when things get normal. I want to emphasize, though, that the IEP can always be changed without a meeting. You can agree to revisions without having to get together, although that might be, again, our custom. In this time of closures, I want to emphasize there's nothing illegal about just agreeing to a written change. We just want to emphasize to parents to make sure that you review the documents carefully, you get them in advance, you're comfortable with them. Don't be pressured, not that schools would do this, but don't be pressured to sign something and send it back right away. And if you have questions, you certainly are entitled to talk to someone about any questions. Just one last tip about IEP changes. Well, the school generally, as a courtesy, will send you the copy of the amendments or the full IEP as revised. I want to point out that technically under federal law, that parents have the duty to ask for a completely revised IEP, or excuse me, an IEP that has revisions in it. So if you want to see the full document again with the IEP amendments incorporated, it's not a bad idea for parents to go ahead and ask for that document as soon as possible. One other point here about signing documents. There's going to be a variety of ways that might happen. What we would encourage parents to do, and we'll get to more tips here in a little bit, is to, regardless of what happens, send your own email to the school afterwards saying that I want to make sure I'm clear and just assuring that I am in agreement with the IEP changes we just discussed, or I'm in disagreement. Well, the district on their end should be documenting that. Remember, teachers and administrators are at home as well. This is all a challenging time. We're all doing multiple things at the same time, making sure kids are staying on task, trying to work. So don't hesitate to back up the conclusion of ARD meetings and IEP changes with your own email, saying what you think just happened, what just happened. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about online instruction, and I want to say, first of all, that this is not, this webinar is really focused on policy and legal. There's a lot of other webinars that have already been started in series, such as by Partners Resource Network, as more hands-on tips for parents to navigate during this period. Those are great resources. I just want to hit on just some legal requirements with regard to online instruction, and that is to mostly emphasize accessibility and equal opportunity requirements. Again, whether we're talking about a Section 504 plan or an IEP, any modifications that you need in the home setting during this period, the school district has a legal duty to provide. Whether that's putting a captioning, like we know we have this feature here today in the Zoom, you'll see in the bottom, there's a button that says closed caption. If you click on that, I believe you can see the transcript of what we're saying. Likewise, if a high school student is going to be attending a live lecture from a high school biology instructor once a week, and for accessibility purposes, it has to be captioned, then by all means, the district has that duty to do that. There are other examples of equal opportunity, whether that's differentiated instruction, adaptation of methods for the student to demonstrate content knowledge. If that discussion with your school district initially doesn't seem to be satisfying your concerns, I want to point out that every school district must have what we refer to as a Section 504 coordinator. That is a school district employee who has the duty to be an advocate for compliance under Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if for some reason accessibility and equal opportunity issues are not addressed in those initial conversations, don't hesitate to reach out to the Section 504 coordinator. And if you don't know who that person is, there's a couple of ways to find out. One, just ask the district, but also on the TEA website, on a feature for school district searches called Ask TED, ASKTED, you can search for the 504 coordinator who's been designated by your district. Hopefully that feature has been updated as well and should be current. Districts have a duty to keep that current, but one way or another, you should be able to find out who your 504 coordinator is. Next slide, please. Just a brief talk about reevaluations. There might be a need to conduct the regular 3-year reevaluation right now. You should nonetheless be going through that normal process of getting consent or providing consent by the parent by having a review of existing data first, what we call the REED, R-E-E-D. Then any new assessment instruments will be administered. Depending upon the nature of that assessment instrument, there may be a delay. Some of it might be able to be done online. Have those conversations with your school district about the status of reevaluations that should be happening on the basis of the regular cycle. But separately, we want to mention that reevaluations may be important at a later date because of the need to check for regression of skills and the need to provide compensatory services. Reevaluations are something that are going to be playing a part in the determination of compensatory services. You as a parent have the right to request a reevaluation. You have the right, if the district says we have existing data, we don't need to do any new instruments, to ask for those new assessments to be administered nonetheless. And finally, you have the right, if you get a reevaluation report that you don't like or don't think is sufficient, I should say, then you have the right to request an independent educational evaluation at public expense. So a lot of those reevaluation issues, some of which will be important now, but some will come up later when we get to the conversations about compensatory services. And just next slide, speaking of compensatory services, I want to make an important distinction here between summer school, extended school year services, and compensatory services. They're not the same thing. So let's say that hopefully this all ends soon enough and some schooling resumes before the end of the regular school year. But the school district says, you know, we're going to keep learning opportunities going through this summer just so that school kids can kind of keep up and catch up. During that time period, that might be considered extended school year services to prevent regression and recoup skills. But that is separate from sort of looking back to say, well, we missed hours and hours of related services, and the skills those services were meant to address have suffered. And so we need to have compensatory services to make up for the loss of those services. That's different than just trying to keep a student afloat. So hopefully, you'll have separate conversations about compensatory services as well as extended school year services and summer school services. But I just want to make the point that those are really two different things. In other words, one is trying to keep the ball moving forward, and the other is looking back to say, well, what did we miss? We have to make that up. Next slide, please. Okay, let's shift gears now and try to take some of that information that I've covered, I know, somewhat quickly about some basic legal requirements and special ed law and 504 law that still apply, and talk a little bit more specifically about what parents can be doing right now and what they should be doing coming up. And I know that we took some poll questions, and this is a good time to go back to PRN and see if the poll results have changed any in terms of the 2 questions we have for our parents. Christina.
Pulling it up now. So on the first question, do you have a copy of your child's current IEP? Where it's 68% say yes, 32% say no. And on the second question of have you heard yet from your child's school about his or her special education services? Percent say yes, 35% say no.
I'm sorry, how many say yes?
65.
65% say yes, and 35% they have not heard yet.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, I appreciate those poll results, and hope we're going to talk about the meaning of these results here now with tips for parents. And obviously, first and foremost, we know that everyone needs to safeguard their families' health, safety, and welfare. And we wish you the best in doing that. And thank you for taking the time out of all of those very basic chores to join us today in this webinar and try to get some assistance in advocating for your child's in special education in Section 504. Know that we're here to be of help both today and going forward, both Partners Resource Network and Disability Rights Texas. It goes without saying that, you know, we have to be patient with ourselves, with our children, and the school system, because, you know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that none of us have ever been through anything like this, except for our oldest generations, perhaps. You know, where the country essentially has been shut down, our state has been shut down, our economy is suffering, school and then public education is suffering. Let's be honest about it. So, you know, we want to do the best possible, but we also kind of have to give ourselves all a break a little bit and know that together we can make it through this. But being together means we have to do a couple of things. We have to be patient with one another, and we have to communicate. So with regard to communication, I want to emphasize 2 things. It's a 2-way street, right? We have to hear from school districts, but they also need to hear from us. So that's one reason why we wanted to have this poll for participants today. And as I understand the results, almost 2/3 of you have heard specifically from your school district about special education for your child and what may be happening next. But there's a good chunk of parents, 35%, who haven't heard anything yet. To those 35%, we want to say 2 things. One, obviously understand that your school district is in the same spot again that the rest of us are. You know, administrators and teachers are working at home. Things may have come back slowly from spring break when this all happened. So do use a little bit of patience. But that being said, if you feel like, hey, it's already been kind of long enough, don't hesitate to reach out to your district. And honestly, and this is I think something that we typically don't do, but we want to make sure that you know that you let your school board of trustees know that you're not hearing anything from your school district. Sometimes it takes reaching up the chain, if you will, to our trustees who are ultimately responsible for your district's compliance, to know that there are some things that maybe aren't going as smoothly as they were told what's going to happen. We just offer that. Now, with regard to your child's Individualized Education Program or IEP, I believe our poll results said that just over 2/3 of you, 68%, have your child's IEP. That's good for those families and those parents, but unfortunately we have a good chunk who don't have it, almost 1/3. And so that's a real issue that I want. If any takeaway for parents today, if you're among those 1/3 almost who do not have your child's IEP, and I know you probably have a lot of other things going on, but you've got to get that document now. You've got to get that document today, this week, because it's essential, especially in this time for several reasons. One, it has what we call the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance we have to know where your child was the last time that IEP was developed as sort of a benchmark or baseline going forward. That piece of the IEP should be telling you, along with progress reports, kind of where you all stood with your child's special education services. And if we don't have a baseline, then it's going to be hard to argue that Stephen went backwards in his skills and his abilities. We also need that IEP to determine what annual goals we're still striving for. And so that's important to have. And finally, and again, not that all parts of the IEP are important, but we're highlighting 3 here that are critically important in this time and age: the statement of special education and related services. Parents, we can't complain that you didn't get something you were entitled to if we don't know ourselves what the student was getting at school before this all happened. So it's really critical that you have your child's IEP document, the last one, for all of the reasons why we do it every time, and in particular for these 3 things: the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, the annual goals, and the statement of special education and related services. Just one other tip as we move forward right now, and that is instructional coaching. There's a reason why this state requires special education teachers to be certified. And that's because, it does take some skills and some specific content knowledge to help students with disabilities grow in our public schools and advance from grade to grade. And while you know and love your children, by and large, I assume most parents aren't teachers. And so don't hesitate to not just ask for communication from your district, ask for your child's IEP, but ask for a coaching session or, practical tips session about how are we going to do all of this. It might be conducted by a conference call, it might be conducted by a Zoom meeting, but don't hesitate to have a one-on-one with somebody at your school once you kind of have a sense of what's going to be happening to help you get through all of this. Next slide, please. The theme of this slide is document, document, document. As we get into having students at home and schools in some form or fashion exercising instructional continuity, implementing instructional continuity, we need you at home to be documenting everything, whether it's what services were in that IEP that now Stephen's not getting, how is Stephen doing with his schoolwork, and perhaps just as important, how is Stephen doing in non-educational areas such as behavior, social skills, mental health, for older students, transition. Schools are being told by the Texas Education Agency to document, document, and document. And parents, I know this is hard to do with everything else going on and the kitchen table a mess, but you need to be doing the same thing. If you don't already have a binder or a notebook or something where you were keeping track of school special education paperwork, you need to do that now. You need to add that copy of the current IEP and start adding these 3 areas at the very least, where you keep your own notes about how your child's doing and what your child's not getting. Next slide, please. This is kind of more down the road tips for parents as we get past this period of school closures. And I know everyone won't be in the same position to do this, but you might want to consider getting a private evaluation of your child from your school psychologist, or excuse me, from your private psychologist or someone else. And that's for 2 different reasons. One is, again, just to help you check how your child is doing, because the school might be hard pressed to get physical access to your child right now. But secondly, when it comes to those reevaluations, part of that process, as I mentioned, is what we call the REED, the REED, and that's a review of existing evaluation data. And so you can have your own relatively new private evaluation to put on the table and say, hey, look, we also had someone visit with Stephen in this period, and this is what they said about him. And so that can help inform the schools about determining where to pick up in the IEP, adjust goals, adjust services, determine compensatory services. So that may not be appropriate for every student. It may not be available for every student, but do consider that as an option. With regard to your child's upcoming summer, we would encourage all parents to start thinking and asking for summer instruction, summer school, extended school year programs, whatever it is to help keep your child's learning going forward, in addition to requesting compensatory services. Again, it's sort of two lenses. One, what are we doing to keep going forward? And second is, what are we doing to make up for what we lost in the past? Next slide, please. Finally, just a couple of miscellaneous tips. And hopefully parents won't encounter this, but there is no reason for you to withdraw your child from your school district right now. If you were going to be moving, that's one thing, but right now our best advice is to, even if you don't think you're getting anything from the school, keep your child enrolled. The next thing is signing documents. Schools are going to be, we mentioned this earlier, asking you to sign, just like they would always do, but there may be different ways of doing that. And in addition to IEP amendments in our documents, you might be asked to sign a consent, you might be asked to sign a release, you might be asked to sign some sort of waiver. Just be very careful about those documents that you don't normally see. Make sure you understand what you're looking at, ask for some advice, ask for some information. Why am I doing this? Some of that might be because the mode of related services has shifted to telehealth or teletherapy, that is electronic communication, and some providers might need a new consent. There's nothing wrong with that. But other times it may be a little odd that you're asked to sign something. Just be careful that you know what you're signing. Obviously, if for some reason you become dislodged from your current home, and be aware that schools still have a duty to serve children who are homeless. And so be aware that if for some reason you lose where you're now or you change residences, that you still have access to education, you still have access to services. Just because you're not in the same place when this all happened doesn't mean, well, I forfeited my child's education and special education. And of course, finally, know that you have all your procedural safeguards. None of those have changed. We hope you don't need to use those, but they're still available. Next slide, please. Just a couple of very quick slides of links to other documents connected to special education and COVID-19 during this period from a couple of different sources. Next slide. We know that families are also encountering a lot of other issues, and so there's some additional slides there. And now let's get to questions and answers. I know there's probably just a few minutes left for today's presentation. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A box. Stephanie and Christina, I think, are going to help me get through some of those. And so let's get started, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can today.
I think I got you.
There we go. We do have a lot of questions, so we're going to work on getting through all of your questions as quickly as we can, but we also want to be respectful of Stephen's time today. So let's get started on questions. So our first question, Stephen, are schools required to do new 504 plans or ARD referrals during this time?
Okay, so with regard to referrals and child find, let me start there since that's sort of an early step in the whole process. All of this does not suspend the duty to make referrals, to initiate evaluations. It may be obviously a very big challenge to do some in-person evaluations, but child find doesn't stop right now. Full initial individual evaluations don't stop right now. There obviously may be some complications, but all of that should be moving forward as best possible. With regard to Section 504 plans, just everything we've said about IEPs, if your child has a 504 plan, pretty much is the same advice. Districts may say we need to make an amendment to the plan to shift some things around. during this period, I would strongly urge you to say, let me see a draft of what you're proposing. Let's have a quick meeting about it. If we're going to agree to something, I want to emphasize that it all get labeled as temporary or COVID-19. We don't want to change the goalpost for students with disabilities during this period. Not that schools would do that, but we don't want to have services altered or lessened or reduced, and then somehow that gets locked in to where the student is going forward when this is all over. Next question.
All right, so several on virtual ARD meetings. So first of all, do you recommend that virtual ARD meetings be recorded?
So great question about ARD meetings, and it's the same process for virtual meetings. As you can tell during this Zoom session, there is a record button. So it is possible if Zoom is used to record the meeting. I would say that, if it's just a very quick discussion, there probably isn't a need to do that. If it's pretty straightforward, but if it's a more lengthy, complicated annual ARD, for instance, that might be worth recording. I would ask the school, if you're going to do that, about what recording options there are that they manage, separate from anything that you might do. But we do encourage parents to be transparent and honest about recording. If you're going to try to record it on your end, be candid with the district that you're trying to do that.
Absolutely. So along the same lines, if parents do not want to meet virtually or by the phone, is there another option, or is there a timeline for having a meeting if they don't want to do it virtually?
Okay, so if parents can't or don't want to meet virtually, then because of the governor's order, there won't be any ARD committee meetings in April then. You'll have to reschedule it as soon as possible in May, presuming the current order expires. But then you also need to check with local orders to see whether or not there's still a sort of shelter-in-place order. So if you want to do it in person, then I guess that's fine, but then just be aware that it can't happen until May at the earliest then.
Excellent. And so do these online meetings violate Ferpa?
So just to be clear, what Ferpa is our federal law that protects the privacy rights of students. So Ferpa protects the disclosure of information from education records. So having a conversation by this, like electronic means, doesn't violate Ferpa in and of itself, but obviously it depends upon who has access to the meeting and what kinds of documents are disclosed. Generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with people holding a meeting virtually that they would go to in person. That does not violate Ferpa. So like if you were meeting with the school special education director, the school psychologist, and you on a Zoom meeting, that does not violate Ferpa.
All right. So changing pace just a little bit, we've had several questions about that don't speak English. So how will schools use interpreter services when it's virtual, and will they be required to provide the IEP in their native language?
Okay, so great questions about parents who do not speak English. And in fact, thanks to PRN and my colleagues at Disability Rights Texas, we're going to be doing another webinar in Spanish and addressing these unique issues in Spanish. But the short of it is that there are a lot of features that might be used, like in a Zoom meeting where on one of the windows there is an interpreter. We could try to use closed captioning and having the statements put into Spanish. But most likely it is going to have to be where someone makes a statement and then we have to pause for the interpreter to speak. So it will be more cumbersome and a slower process. But I believe that this circumstance doesn't waive those requirements, just to be clear, but there will have to be some creativity and probably a lot more time devoted to meetings to allow that interpretation to occur and translation to occur.
All right, excellent. So there's a lot of questions about related services. So I'm going to kind of just let you speak on, are districts required to provide related services right now? And if they can't provide the same time, so 45 minutes of occupational therapy or speech therapy, will they be required to make up those hours once students go back into the schools?
Okay, so great question about related services. And obviously there's lots of different kinds of related services. Some of which can continue to be provided, but just through an electronic mode. And I mentioned, for instance, the delivery of, let's say, special education counseling virtually as opposed to in person. There may be a need for some changes to the to protect the privacy of the student on the home end, as well as to make sure the provider is providing privacy protections. So it just depends on the nature of the related services, but there's nothing in this that's happening that says that all of a sudden now related services do not have to be provided, that there's some grace period of suspension for related services. There's nothing like that. I want to be clear. Also, I want to be clear that if your district is just saying as a blanket statement, we're not doing related services, that's wrong. That's a violation of the law. And you should contact Disability Rights Texas if you and other parents find that your district is doing that. And then lastly, obviously, yes, just like special education, if some related service is not provided, then that will become an issue for compensatory services discussion after this is all over. So again, going back to our point about almost a third of parents here today don't have a copy of their IEP. It's really important to have that because we can't complain and track what's not being provided if we don't have that documentation in front of us. And it would not to say that districts aren't going to be candid with you about what they're delivering and not delivering, but we're really encouraging parents on their own to track and document.
Absolutely. So a question here, their child was in the process of having a functional behavioral assessment. They were in the middle of that when all of this hit. So what is your suggestions to make sure that that gets completed?
So functional behavioral assessments, just like any other aspect of either a full initial individual evaluation or reevaluation, if that part of that process requires an in-person visit, then because of the current orders, that's just not going to happen. So that one needs to be rescheduled just as soon as possible when restrictions are lifted. But in the meantime, is there other information that we've drawn from the other parts of observations or reevaluations or FIEs that can help us put together some suggestions now? It may not translate into a full behavioral intervention plan or BIP or BIP, but that doesn't mean that we can't use some of that information to give some helpful tips to parents or to give some guidance to a teacher when he or she is checking in with the family. Just because we can't complete all of it doesn't mean we shouldn't get something out of that process and it translated into other instructional and related service aids or guides, both for the at home and for the teacher working with the student.
All right. So Steve, does there need to be a change of placement noted in an IEP to moving to home services at the 10-day mark since we're changing placement?
So that's a good question. So placement has a legal meaning in special education, of course, and generally speaking, we make a distinction between location and placement. And so schools have discretion over the location of services. As long as the substance of the special education is still the same, they can say, well, Stephen, you're not going to be in Miss Susie's class now, you're going to be in Mr. John's class. That change of location didn't change the placement. But obviously in this situation, anything that's substantively now altered because of this situation you should have conversations with the art committee about formally documenting a change of placement and what that change of placement means for the delivery of services.
Okay. So, can compensatory services be requested in the form of money for private therapy?
So a good question about compensatory services, and probably down the line here, we might want to think about more information about compensatory services and a more formal program. But that being said, generally speaking, compensatory services are educational services. They're made up by the school district because it's the district that owed those services to the student. And just sort of alluding to the conversation we just had about what's a change in location versus what's a change in placement, generally school districts have discretion to decide how they're going to deliver something. You know, those are going to be conversations that you'll have to have with your school district about whether or not the delivery of compensatory services might in part be through a private therapist in the community as opposed to someone on the school staff. If that were to happen, then, for instance, the district would be hiring that private provider, and they would be under the direction of the school district because it's the district that has the duty to provide those compensatory services. So if the thought is I can just get like a check from the district and go pay for services on my own, I mean, I'm not saying that that can happen, but the district isn't legally required to do it that way.
All right. So we've got a question specific about dyslexia services. And so it's a very specific program that to be exercised with fidelity, you must comply with the program and have the full like 45 minutes or an hour. It's supposed to be taught by a trained dyslexia specialist and not a parent. So what are your thoughts regarding those issues, specifically in context of that dyslexia program and the need for very specific timed instruction?
Sure. So great question about dyslexia services. So any student who has dyslexia is going to probably be recognized under IDEA or Section 504 as a child with a disability, right? I mean, they're going to fall under one of those two umbrellas. So we want to be mindful of that. And just because, let's say, for instance, if a student were under special education with an IEP and these dyslexia services are there, then obviously we would follow that general process about the continuity of those services in the home setting and have those conversations with the ARD about any revisions or changes. Likewise, if the student, however, fell under Section 504, that would be a 504 committee determination if there needs to be any changes. But just because this whole circumstance has happened, and even though it's no fault of the district, they don't get a pass on providing equal opportunity to students. And equal opportunity isn't just like having the chance to go to a field trip just like everyone else. It's equal opportunity to benefit from the programming of the school, and that would include dyslexia services.
All right, excellent. So a couple of questions about providing instruction. So what specific guidance are you using to determine that providing virtual instruction is equivalent to a school day? And does a link to a website or a generic packet of work count as providing instruction and a school day?
Okay, well, that is a great question. And I hate to give this answer, but it sort of depends. So I want to be clear that in all of the general guidance about these school closures, I want to be clear that schools are essentially getting credit as if your child's in attendance, what we call average daily attendance or ADA. If the school district is doing something for students by way of sort of this virtual instruction, online instruction, or for that matter, low-tech packets. So there is guidance about, generally speaking from TEA, about attendance, about grading, about graduation requirements that are just as applicable to students with disabilities as it is to anyone else. So we have to start there first. And then secondly, though, with regard to any particular link, whether that satisfies a requirement or not, it's impossible to answer that question in isolation. It just depends upon the nature of that student's IEP, and if access to some of that content online and self-directed, if you will, still achieves the delivery of those services and may or may not. Again, sorry to say this, but it's sort of hard to answer just in isolation.
Absolutely. All right. We want to be mindful of your time, Stephen. We have a number of other questions, but we know that Stephen has some other things that he needs to be moving on to. So thank you, Stephen, for all of your advice and for everything that you gave us today. It was a lot of information. I know we still have a lot of questions that people have. Is there a way that people could reach out? Should they reach out to Disability Rights if they have questions? Any further questions?
Can we go back a slide or two to the special ed resources? Okay, well, so a couple more slides, I think. Right there. So just to be clear, that very first link is to our website at Disability Rights Texas. It's www.disabilityrightstx.org or org.org. If you go to that website, you'll find contact information for disability rights where you can apply for individual advocacy assistance. I strongly encourage you to let us know if you are being patient, yet finding the circumstance challenging to you and your child. If it just doesn't seem right or it's been long enough, please feel free to reach out to us and ask us for individual advocacy assistance. That's the best way to one-on-one examine these questions. So I want to offer that. And when you go to our website, you'll find our toll-free number. We're still answering the phone, as well as our standard online intake application process that you can use on your phone or your tablet or your computer at home.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen. We do want to let you know of a couple of upcoming things that we have going on. Christina's going to get those slides for us. So tomorrow we're finishing up our Facebook Live series that we've been doing with Region 10 Education Service Center. So at 1:00 p.m. Central Time is the last of those. We're going to be looking at your child's academic and functional skills and practicing some mobility tasks in the home. So join us on Facebook Live, or you can join us by Zoom if you don't have access to Facebook. We're also going to be presenting this same disability rights in Spanish that we did today. That's going to be on Monday, April 6th at 12:15. So Disability Rights is going to do the same presentation in Spanish for us then. And then coming up on Tuesday, April 14th, also at 12:15 p.m., we are going to be doing a webinar on transition planning, paving the way for your child's future success with Nina Zuna from the University of Texas at Austin Center for Disability Studies. So join us for these upcoming webinars. And again, Stephen, I want to thank you for your time today and for answering all those questions. Our contact information at Partners Resource Network is up, so feel free to reach out to us as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it so much.
You're welcome. Good luck to everybody. Stay safe and well.
And thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate it.